Margaret Thompson shuffled slowly through the crowded streets of London, her weathered hands gripping her walking stick with determination. At 78 years old, she had learned to navigate the bustling city with careful steps and watchful eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows between the tall buildings as she made her way toward the local market, a routine she had followed for nearly 40 years. Her small pension barely covered her monthly expenses, but Margaret refused to let financial struggles dim her spirit. She had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in a factory accident decades ago. Now, with her children living in different cities, she found comfort in her daily walks and interactions with shopkeepers who knew her by name. The streets were particularly busy that Tuesday morning. Office workers hurried past with their coffee cups and briefcases, tourists studied their maps with confused expressions, and street vendors called out their daily specials. Margaret moved carefully along the sidewalk, staying close to the shop windows to avoid the rushing crowd. She paused outside a small bakery where the sweet smell of fresh bread filled the air. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen, the baker, arranging croissants in neat rows. Margaret waved, and the elderly Chinese woman smiled back warmly, gesturing for her to come inside. These small moments of connection meant everything to Margaret, who often spent entire days without speaking to another person. As she pushed open the bakery door, the familiar chime announced her arrival. Mrs. Chen looked up from behind the counter, her face brightening with genuine pleasure. The two women had developed an unlikely friendship over the years, bonding over their shared experiences of aging in a city that seemed to move faster each day. Mrs. Chen spoke in her heavily accented English, asking about Margaret's health and whether she needed any help with her shopping. Margaret appreciated the kindness, though she was determined to maintain her independence for as long as possible. She purchased a small loaf of bread and a single muffin, carefully counting out the exact change from her worn leather purse. The conversation between the two women was interrupted by the loud voices of a group of teenagers who had gathered outside the bakery window. Their laughter carried an edge that made Margaret feel uneasy, though she tried to dismiss her concerns as the worries of an old woman who perhaps no longer understood the humor of young people. Mrs. Chen noticed Margaret's discomfort and offered to call her son to give Margaret a ride home. But Margaret politely declined, insisting that the walk was good exercise and that she enjoyed observing the changes in her neighborhood. She tucked her purchases into her canvas shopping bag and prepared to continue her journey. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, Margaret noticed that the group of teenagers had grown larger. They were pointing at various passers-by and making comments that she couldn't quite hear over the traffic noise. Something about their behavior reminded her of the bullies who had sometimes targeted her children when they were young, and she felt a familiar protective instinct rise within her chest. Margaret decided to take a different route home, one that would lead her past the impressive gates of Buckingham Palace. She had always found comfort in the grandeur of the royal residence, and today she felt drawn to the stability and tradition it represented. The tourists would be thick around the palace, but she preferred their excited chatter to the unsettling energy she had sensed from the teenagers. The walk toward Buckingham Palace took Margaret through several busy intersections and past a variety of shops and cafes. She moved at her own pace, stopping occasionally to catch her breath and to observe the life of the city flowing around her. A street musician played violin near a subway entrance, his case open for donations, and Margaret paused to listen to a beautiful melody that reminded her of her late husband. As she approached the area near the palace, the crowd of tourists grew thicker. Families with children pointed cameras at everything. Tour groups followed guides holding colorful umbrellas, and vendors sold postcards and souvenirs from small stands. Margaret found herself caught in the middle of a particularly large group of visitors who were all trying to get the perfect photograph of the palace gates. The pushing and shoving was gentle but persistent, and Margaret began to feel overwhelmed by the press of bodies around her. Her walking stick was jostled several times, and she worried about losing her balance on the uneven pavement. She tried to move toward the edge of the crowd, but each step seemed to bring her into contact with another person who was too focused on their camera or guidebook to notice her struggle. A young man with a large backpack accidentally bumped into her, causing her to stumble slightly. He turned to apologize, but his words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Margaret smiled and nodded to show that she was unhurt, though her heart was beating faster from the brief moment of panic. She realized that she needed to find a quieter spot to rest and collect herself before continuing her journey home. Near the palace gates, she spotted a low stone wall that bordered a small garden area. It wasn't an official seating area, but several other people were resting there, including an elderly man reading a newspaper and a mother with a sleeping baby in a stroller. Margaret made her way carefully through the crowd and settled onto the wall, grateful for the chance to sit down and observe the scene from a safer distance. From her new vantage point, she could see the famous red-uniformed guards standing at attention near the palace entrance. Their tall black hats and serious expressions commanded respect from the tourists, who maintained a respectful distance while taking their photographs. Margaret had always admired the discipline and dedication of these young men, who stood for hours in all kinds of weather, representing centuries of British tradition. She was enjoying the spectacle and feeling more relaxed when she noticed a familiar group approaching through the crowd. It was the same teenagers she had seen outside the bakery, and they appeared to be moving in her direction. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with anxiety, though she told herself that there was no reason to assume they meant any harm. The group consisted of 5 young people, probably in their late teens or early 20s. They wore casual clothes and carried themselves with the confident swagger that Margaret remembered from her own children's teenage years. But there was something different about their energy, something that made her instinctively want to make herself smaller and less noticeable. As they drew closer, Margaret could hear fragments of their conversation. They were making jokes about the tourists and mocking some of the people around them. Their laughter was loud and harsh, cutting through the more cheerful sounds of families enjoying their visit to the palace. Margaret tried to focus on watching the guards and ignore the approaching group, but she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming her way. The teenagers stopped near her section of the wall, and Margaret felt their attention turn toward her. She kept her eyes fixed on the palace gates, hoping that they would lose interest and move on to other entertainment. But she could sense them studying her, and she heard one of them make a comment about her appearance that made the others laugh. The comments started quietly, almost as if the teenagers were testing the waters. One of them, a tall boy with bleached hair, made a remark about Margaret's old-fashioned coat. Another, a girl with multiple piercings, giggled and added something about her walking stick. At first, Margaret tried to convince herself that they were just being thoughtless rather than deliberately cruel, the way young people sometimes were without realizing the impact of their words. But the comments grew louder and more pointed. They began to imitate the way she had been walking, exaggerating her careful steps and the way she held her walking stick. The tall boy put on a fake elderly voice and pretended to complain about his back, while the others laughed and encouraged him to continue his performance. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Other people in the area began to notice what was happening. Some tourists looked uncomfortable and moved away, not wanting to get involved in an unpleasant situation. Others stared openly, some with disapproval at the teenagers' behavior, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that drew people to watch accidents. Margaret felt exposed and vulnerable, like an animal in a zoo being gawked at by visitors. The elderly man who had been reading his newspaper folded it up and stood to leave, shaking his head with obvious disgust. The mother with the baby stroller also moved her child away from the scene, shooting angry looks at the teenagers who seemed oblivious to the discomfort they were causing. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated as decent people distanced themselves from the ugly scene. One of the teenagers, emboldened by the laughter of his friends, approached Margaret more closely. He began asking her questions in a mock polite tone that was clearly designed to humiliate her. He asked if she needed help crossing the street, if she knew what year it was, and whether she had remembered to take her medicine that morning. Each question was delivered with a smirk that made his true intentions crystal clear. Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she was determined not to let these cruel young people see her cry. She had survived much worse things in her life: the death of her husband, years of financial struggle, the challenges of raising 3 children alone. But there was something particularly painful about being mocked for the simple crime of growing old, for the physical changes that came to everyone who was fortunate enough to live a long life. The harassment escalated when one of the girls in the group began to mimic Margaret's posture and movements more aggressively. She hunched over dramatically and pretended to be confused about where she was, asking her friends in a quavering voice if they had seen her teeth or her wig. The performance was cruel and inaccurate, but it drew loud laughter from the group and encouraged them to become even more bold in their bullying. Margaret tried to stand up and walk away, but her legs felt shaky from the stress and embarrassment. The teenagers noticed her difficulty and began to comment on that as well, suggesting that she might fall over or need to be carried home like a baby. Their words felt like physical blows, each comment designed to strip away another piece of her dignity. The situation was attracting more attention now, but not the kind that would help Margaret. Some people were taking out their phones, perhaps, to record the scene for social media. Others were pointing and talking among themselves, treating the harassment as if it were some kind of entertainment rather than a real person being hurt in real time. Margaret felt completely alone despite being surrounded by dozens of people. She looked around desperately for someone who might intervene, for another adult who would tell these teenagers to stop their cruelty and move along. But everyone seemed content to watch from a distance, to disapprove silently rather than take any action that might put them at risk of becoming targets themselves. Just when Margaret felt that the situation couldn't get any worse, she heard a different kind of voice cutting through the teenagers' laughter. It was calm, authoritative, and unmistakably British. She looked up to see one of the palace guards, walking toward their group with measured, purposeful steps. His red uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, and his expression serious but not harsh. The teenager who had been leading the harassment noticed the approaching guard and tried to play innocent, stepping back from Margaret and putting on a fake smile. The others in the group sensed the shift in atmosphere, and their laughter died down to nervous giggles. They had clearly not expected their cruel entertainment to attract the attention of someone in authority. The guard was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, with kind eyes that contrasted with his formal bearing. Despite his youth, he carried himself with the confidence and dignity that came from representing something larger than himself. As he drew closer, Margaret could see that his attention was focused entirely on her, not on the teenagers who had been tormenting her. Without acknowledging the harassers directly, the guard approached Margaret with a gentle smile that transformed his previously stern expression. He asked if she was enjoying her visit to the palace, speaking to her as if she were an honored guest, rather than someone who had just been publicly humiliated. His voice was warm and respectful, treating her with the courtesy that the teenagers had so conspicuously failed to show. Margaret was surprised by his approach and initially struggled to respond. She had expected him to tell the teenagers to move along or perhaps to lecture them about their behavior. Instead, he seemed determined to focus on her well-being and to restore her sense of dignity through his own respectful treatment of her. She managed to answer that yes, she always enjoyed seeing the palace, though her voice was still shaky from the ordeal. The guard introduced himself as James and asked if she had ever seen the changing of the guard ceremony. When Margaret replied that she had seen it many years ago but not recently, he began to describe the intricate traditions and training that went into the famous ritual. His knowledge was extensive, and he spoke with genuine enthusiasm about the history and significance of his role. As James continued his conversation with Margaret, the teenagers began to realize that their entertainment was over. The guards' presence had completely changed the dynamic of the situation, and their behavior now seemed not just cruel, but also petty and small in comparison to his dignified conduct. One by one, they began to drift away, muttering among themselves and looking for easier targets elsewhere. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time since the harassment had begun. James's respectful attention was like a healing balm after the cruelty she had endured. He asked about her interest in royal history and listened carefully to her answers, treating her knowledge and opinions as valuable contributions to their conversation rather than the confused ramblings that the teenagers had implied they were. Other tourists and passers-by began to notice the interaction between the guard and the elderly woman, but their attention felt different now. Instead of the uncomfortable staring that had accompanied the harassment, people seemed charmed by the sight of the young guard taking time to chat respectfully with Margaret. Some smiled as they passed, and a few even paused to listen to parts of their conversation. James seemed completely comfortable with the attention their conversation was drawing. He continued to treat Margaret as if she were the most important person in the area, asking about her family and her life in London with genuine interest. When she mentioned that she was a widow, he expressed his condolences with a sincerity that brought tears to her eyes. But these were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation. The guard's kindness was having a ripple effect on the people around them. Other tourists began to approach elderly visitors more respectfully, perhaps inspired by the example they were witnessing. The atmosphere in the area shifted from one of indifference and casual cruelty to something warmer and more human. As their conversation continued, James noticed that Margaret seemed tired and asked if she would like to sit down somewhere more comfortable. He gestured toward a nearby bench that was partially shaded by a large tree, explaining that many visitors found it a pleasant spot to rest and observe the palace activities. His offer was made with such natural courtesy that Margaret accepted without feeling like she was accepting charity. James walked beside her as she made her way to the bench, adjusting his pace to match her careful steps. He offered his arm for support when she needed to navigate around a small group of tourists, and his assistance felt respectful rather than condescending. Margaret realized that she hadn't been treated with such consideration in months, perhaps years. Once Margaret was settled comfortably on the bench, James continued their conversation while remaining standing in a respectful posture. He asked about the changes she had seen in London over the decades she had lived there, and Margaret found herself sharing stories about her neighborhood, her children, and the various jobs she had held over the years. James listened with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he was truly engaged with what she was telling him. Their conversation was interrupted periodically by tourists who wanted to ask James questions or take photographs with him. Each time, he politely asked them to wait a moment while he finished talking with Margaret, making it clear that his conversation with her was his priority. This simple gesture meant more to Margaret than she could have imagined, to be treated as important by someone who represented such an prestigious institution. During one of these brief interruptions, an elderly gentleman approached and thanked James for his kindness to Margaret. He explained that he had witnessed the harassment she had endured and was impressed by the way the guard had handled the situation. The man's words made Margaret realize that others had indeed noticed her distress and were grateful to see it, addressed with such dignity. As word of the kind interaction began to spread among the tourists, more people started to pay attention to their conversation. A family with young children paused to listen as James explained some of the architectural features of the palace, including Margaret in his explanations and asking for her observations as someone who had watched the building and its surroundings change over many years. The children in the family were particularly fascinated by Margaret's stories about London in earlier decades. She told them about how different the area had looked when she was young, describing shops and buildings that were no longer there. James encouraged her storytelling, adding historical context that helped the children understand the significance of the changes she described. Margaret began to feel like she was contributing something valuable rather than simply being helped. Her knowledge and memories were being treated as treasures rather than the worthless reminiscences of an old woman. The respect that James showed for her experiences seemed to give others permission to value them as well, and she found herself surrounded by interested listeners. A tour guide leading a small group noticed the gathering and asked if he could bring his tourists over to hear some of Margaret's stories about local history. James looked to Margaret for permission before agreeing, making sure she was comfortable with the additional attention. When she nodded, he introduced her to the group as someone who had witnessed decades of changes in the area. Margaret's confidence grew as she realized that people were genuinely interested in what she had to say. She described the neighborhood markets of her youth, the way people dressed and traveled in earlier decades, and the gradual changes she had observed in the types of people who visited the palace. Her audience listened with respectful attention, asking thoughtful questions and thanking her for sharing her memories. The transformation from harassment victim to respected storyteller happened gradually, but Margaret could feel her sense of dignity and self-worth returning with each interested question and grateful smile. James had not just rescued her from a difficult situation. He had reminded her of her own value as a person with knowledge, experiences, and stories worth sharing. As the afternoon progressed, James eventually needed to return to his official duties. But before he left, he made sure that Margaret felt comfortable and safe. He introduced her to another guard who would be in the area and suggested that she might enjoy visiting the palace gardens on another day when they were open to the public. His recommendations were offered as one friend might give to another, not as obligations or charity. Margaret thanked James profusely for his kindness, though she struggled to find words adequate to express what his intervention had meant to her. She had arrived at the palace feeling humiliated and powerless, but she was leaving with her dignity restored and her faith in human kindness renewed. James simply smiled and said that it had been his pleasure to meet her, treating their conversation as if it had been a privilege for him, rather than a duty he had performed. Several of the tourists who had witnessed the entire interaction approached Margaret as James returned to his post. They wanted to thank her for sharing her stories and to express their admiration for the way she had handled the earlier harassment. A young mother with children told Margaret that she hoped someone would treat her own mother with such kindness if she ever found herself in a similar situation. The family with young children asked if they could take a photograph with Margaret, explaining that they wanted to remember the wonderful stories she had told them about old London. When she agreed, they gathered around her with genuine warmth, treating her like a beloved grandmother rather than a stranger they had just met. The photograph captured smiling faces and the kind of intergenerational connection that had become rare in modern urban life. Word of the incident and James's intervention began to spread beyond the immediate area. Several tourists posted about the experience on social media, praising both the guard's kindness and Margaret's grace under pressure. The posts attracted hundreds of positive comments from people around the world who were touched by the story of respect triumphing over cruelty. A local newspaper reporter who happened to be in the area interviewing tourists about their palace visits heard about the incident and asked if he could speak with Margaret. She was hesitant at first, not wanting to seem like she was seeking attention or pity. But when the reporter explained that he wanted to write about the positive example that James had set, she agreed to share her story. The article that appeared in the next day's paper focused on the guard's exemplary conduct and the way his kindness had transformed a negative situation into something beautiful. Margaret was portrayed not as a victim, but as a dignified woman whose knowledge and experiences had enriched the day for everyone who met her. The story resonated with readers who shared it widely and left comments about their own experiences with both cruelty and unexpected kindness. Margaret returned to the palace area several times in the following weeks, not hoping to recreate the dramatic events of that day, but simply because she felt welcome there in a way she hadn't experienced elsewhere. Other guards recognized her from the newspaper article and greeted her warmly, and tourists occasionally approached her to ask about her stories of old London. The incident had changed something fundamental in Margaret's relationship with her city and her sense of her own worth. She walked with more confidence, spoke up more readily in conversations, and felt less invisible than she had in years. The teenager's cruelty had been real and painful, but James's kindness had been more powerful, reminding her and everyone who witnessed it that dignity and respect were always choices that individuals could make. Months later, Margaret received a formal invitation to attend a palace garden party, an honor that she treasured not just for its prestige, but for what it represented about the enduring impact of treating others with genuine respect and kindness. The invitation was signed by James, who had been promoted partly based on the positive attention his compassionate conduct had brought to the palace guard. His simple act of decency had created ripples that continued to spread long after that memorable afternoon when harassment had been transformed into hope.